Good evening. Oh, wow, that's loud.
This is perfect. We can't see any of you.
Yes.
Oh, thanks a lot for waving. Now I'm nervous.
But we can hear you. We know you're there. Welcome, welcome. I'm Kurt Graham, the director here of the Truman Library, and it's such a great pleasure to welcome you out to this program with Clifton, Truman, Daniel. And before we get started, I want to mention a couple of things about upcoming programs and about the series of programs that we're in. We're doing a series of programs to celebrate and augment the exhibit that we have downstairs of Saving the White House, the Truman's renovation of the White House. And this these series of programs have been generously funded by the Missouri Humanities Council and the Arvin Gottlieb Charitable Foundation. And coming up in next month, in August, we will have Jackson's White House with Howard Keitel. And then in September, we will have Photographing the President with Pete Souza, who was the White House photographer for both President Obama and President Reagan. So that should be a very interesting set of programs as well. And of course, tonight is no exception, because we welcome back to the Truman Library the President's oldest grandson, Clifton Truman, Daniel.
Can you hold off just a moment?
Yeah.
Before starting the program, I apologize, but the streaming's not working, and it's not fair to the other 50 people not to be a part of it.
We're sorry?
You don't want to leave out the streamers. That's not...
Yeah.
Be nice to the streamer.
Be nice to the streamers. Okay, well, so...
Great. This wasn't written in.
Yeah. I don't have this in my notes. I'm not exactly sure where to go from here. Well...
What? Nobody say sing. That's not going to happen.
Yeah.
We tell a joke?
Yeah. That's not fair to the others either, trust me. I've heard all these jokes.
I got to figure a Truman era joke.
Truman era joke.
Yeah.
Well, a Truman saying. I will tell you. I'll start you off with and maybe some of you have heard me say this before, but the very first time I met Clifton, when I was first being introduced to the board by the archivist who had just barely appointed me, so I'm meeting these people for the first time. Herb Kahn and John Sherman flew up to Chicago, and we met Clifton at O'Hare Airport. We had a nice little conference room, and we had this lovely little conversation. And I've just read McCullough's book. I'm trying to let them know that, no, I know Truman. I can do this. This is going to be really good. And we got talking about some different sayings that Harry Truman would offer up, and I've always thought of him as sort of the Will Rogers of the American presidency, kind of these folksy, witty, wisdom kind of things. And Clifton just casually said, my favorite saying that Grandpa ever said was, never kick a fresh turd on a hot day. Yeah. And the thing that was troubling about that is I didn't know if I was the guy with the dirty boots or if I was the fresh turd. I wasn't sure where I fit into that equation. So
well, it just seems like very self-evident advice, right? And of course, first time I heard it, I had no idea what that was because I grew up in New York. I had none of it's fresh in New York, and it's all left around the trees.
Well, anybody else have a Truman saying they'd like to throw out to?
I'm trying to think of a Truman story that doesn't have anything to do with the subject at hand. Grandpa. I love the stories about Grandpa being himself, and I apologize to those of you who've heard this one. In retirement, he didn't have Secret Service protection until early 1964, after JFK was assassinated. So the first 10 years of his retirement, he was on his own. The Secret Service gave him the key to the gate, the 5-foot steel fence around the house, and said, good luck. We're going to go work for President Eisenhower now. And so one day the man's car broke down in front of the house. And the guy didn't know where he was. It didn't have a sign on it like it does today. So he walked through the front gate and up the front steps, and he rang the doorbell. And my grandfather answered the door in his shirt sleeves, and the guy said, my car broke down. Do you have a phone? And Grandpa said, sure, come on in. The guy used the phone in the front hall, and the garage folks told him it's going to be 10, 15 minutes before we can get over there. And the man said, that's all right, I'll see you. It's good. And he told my grandfather, he said, I'm going to wait by the car for these guys. And Grandpa said, no, don't do that. And they sat down in the living room and talked for 10 or 15 minutes. Apparently got along just great. And finally, Grandpa looked out the window and said, I think the garage guy's here. And the man got up and he shook Grandpa's hand and he said, thank you for the phone, for the hospitality, for the help. And Grandpa said, you're welcome. It's nice talking to you. I hope it doesn't cost too much. And the man walked out the front door and he got halfway down the front steps and he stopped. And he turned and he looked back at my grandfather and he said, you know something? And please don't take offense. But you look a hell of a lot like that son of a bitch, Harry Truman. And my grandfather smiled at him and said, no offense at all, I am that son of a bitch.
Well,
I may have just shot the whole program.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I'm wondering if...
now what do we do?
It's going to be really hard to top this opening. I just don't know what we're going to do.
Yeah, usually that's the end.
Yeah.
Damn it.
Do we have any idea of an ETA? I look, but in vain.
We're the poor streamers. They're all sitting at their laptops. Just,
yeah.
It's like that's what my wife does at home. Why isn't this working?
You can just pull out your phones and stream it on Facebook, and then they would be able to.
Yeah, no, okay. That's a good idea.
We'll do the questions first.
This is all backwards. See, Kurt and I have no idea what we're doing anyway, so
there's no plan. Go ahead, fire away.
We'll
Questions.
Try.
Who's got a question?
Right here.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just wonder if you would care to give us any impressions of the current situation.
Well,
I'm going to go check on those streamers and see if they're...
I'll come with you.
Yeah.
I will just...
Are we good?
Or what do you think your grandfather would say?
Okay, there we go.
Bleep, 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 bleep.
And I will tell you, I've answered that question only once, and I was caught off guard because I try. My job is to take care of my grandfather's legacy, and I'm all about reconciliation and understanding. I think we need, generally, I'll just say up front, we should all be talking to each other a little more closely in this country rather than... and I mean listening. If you don't ask somebody, how could you? You say, why? And then you sit and listen to the answer. But anyway, that said, I was out in California a little more than a year ago doing a program with Masahiro Sasaki, whose sister Sadako's crane is in the front lobby. Mm-hmm. Masahiro is a survivor of Hiroshima, and we were out there at the same time that President Obama was in Hiroshima. So of course, the Japanese press people were calling us, the Sasakis and me, all day long, on and off, wanting opinions on what we thought of the president's going to Hiroshima. And I was getting ready for a program with them at Santa Monica High School. So I'm standing outside in the California sunshine, and at this cell phone call I've gotten 3 or 4 times, and finally I thought, okay, I've got a minute, I'll answer it, because we hadn't started yet. So I answered the call. It was a London radio show calling me at Santa Monica High School, and they said, can you go on for 5 minutes with Ian? And I said, sure. I'm not doing anything else. And so Ian got on the phone, and we talked about Hiroshima. And then finally he says, okay, one last question. What would your grandfather think of President Trump? Or Trump, he was candidate. What would your grandfather think of Donald Trump? And I couldn't help myself. I said, Ian, I don't think I can use that kind of language on British radio. So that's the only time that I've, let it slip. Needless to say, I don't think that President Truman and President Trump line up very closely, publicly or privately.
Very politic. Very good answer. Very good answer. Well, I believe we have the streamers joining us now. Welcome, streamers. We've just been kind of doing the old soft shoe here, just waiting for you. So you haven't missed a thing. We haven't spoken at all. We're on the first slide. Haven't missed a thing. I wanted to just sort of start, now that we're starting the program, and talking about a little bit about just the situation we find ourselves in terms of the relationship. I don't think people always understand what goes into a presidential library. The presidential library system consists of a partnership between the federal government through the National Archives, which is what I represent here as the director, and of course our partner, the Truman Library Institute, with a board, and it's a 501c3 nonprofit partner, and of course the presidential family. Those three elements comprise sort of the three-legged stool, if you will, that holds up every presidential library. And I'm familiar enough with the system now and know enough of my colleagues, my library director colleagues around the system, to know that we are blessed in both regards, and that we have a wonderful foundation, a great relationship with the Truman Library Institute. And so appreciate their support and their help and the kind of working relationship that we've developed. But also we're very, very fortunate to have the family that we have to work with. Fantastic family, and I'm saying that not just because you're here. I've said that when you've been as far away as Chicago. I mean, it's just, it's the truth. But there are some stories that would be every bit as entertaining as anything you've heard so far about other families, but we're not in that business, so we're not going to do that. But this program tonight, I think, is very special for us because Clifton has some very unique perspectives. He did not live in the White House, or he was not around when his grandfather was president, but from the time he was knee-high to a grasshopper, he grew up hearing stories about the White House, his mother's experience there and his grandparents' experience there. So I think that it's an insight that most of us just don't have and can't get in any other way. So as we turn to the renovation of the White House, I start by kind of wondering, how did someone as reluctant as Harry Truman to come to the White House become the guy who would renovate the White House?
Well, he didn't have a choice. Is this the thingy? Is this what
That's the thing. Oh, yeah. So there's a button there. Let me show you.
Okay. Yeah. You better show me how the thingy works.
Upper right, right
Upper
there.
Upper right. Okay. Yeah. Good. Next.
Next.
I love this picture because look at my grandfather's face. It's the only time I've ever seen him like, oh my God, I'm vice president. He was a reluctant, as most of you know, reluctant vice president. He didn't seek the job. He was in fact sort of bullied into it by President Roosevelt, who said to the Democratic national chairman, tell him fine, if he doesn't want to run with me, fine, go ahead and wreck the Democratic Party. So he went, and that's Henry Wallace to his right, the outgoing vice president. And of course, Mr. Wallace has a little smile on his face because he's getting out. And of course, my grandmother was even less pleased. That's the look she gives you when you put the marbles down the heating grate, too.
Yeah.
He worked hard after that. He was a reluctant vice president. He took over the presidency on April 12th, 1945, when FDR died. But then in 1948, worked hard, 30,000 miles, 300 speeches, to win the presidency in his own right. So it must have been kind of a shock to him when he came back and he worked so hard to win the White House. He didn't get to live there his entire second term. And I got to remember which slide is next. He was alone a lot. He joked, he called it the Great White Jail. He was alone a lot in the White House, and he would write to my grandmother and to my mother about the ghosts, the popping and the creaking. He even heard a knock on his door one night, 3 o'clock in the morning, got up, answered the door, and there was nobody there. In the White House, 3 o'clock in the morning, he kept hearing noises. And he didn't realize at the time that this was trouble, serious trouble with the White House. When they got to the White House, when my grandparents got to the White House, they were dismayed at the condition of the upstairs living quarters. The downstairs public rooms looked fantastic. But upstairs, after war and the Depression, the Roosevelts had not felt it politic or even a good idea to put a lot of money or time into the living quarters. So it was kind of drab and dingy. The curtains were frayed, the carpet was run down, the paint needed redoing. Mrs. Roosevelt felt bad about this, and she went over to Blair House, where my grandparents were staying before moving in, and apologized for the condition of the upstairs living quarters. And she also said, and by the way, it's not only the drab curtains, you have rats. And she told my grandfather a story. She was out on the south porch downstairs having lunch with 3 or 4 ladies of Washington, and apparently a large rat ran along the balustrade next to them. And my grandfather said what was really funny about that was that all 4 or 5 of the ladies pretended they hadn't seen it. Mrs. Roosevelt included. And the seriousness of this began to be evident, and I'm sort of jumping around here today because that wasn't the first story I ever heard of the White House. But that's Eugene List. He played for my grandfather in Potsdam when he was an Army sergeant, and he played again at the White House. This is a later picture. This is Grandpa out of office. But Mr. List gave a concert at the White House in the East Room. And during the concert, engineers came to my grandfather and told him that the 1,200-pound chandelier hanging over everybody's head was about to let go. And Grandpa had a choice to make, and he took what, for me, seems a rather risky choice for Harry Truman. He let the concert go on, and they took the chandelier down the next day. But that was one indicator of how bad it was. And that's that chandelier hanging right over the piano. That's my mother, and that's her piano in the sitting room. And this was the first story one of the first stories I ever heard about the White House, was that the leg of Mom's piano had gone through the floor. And it went through the floor above the family dining quarters and actually lowered the ceiling in the family dining room by 1.5 feet. The floor just sort of caved in under the weight of the piano. And that was kind of the last straw, with, beginning to realize how badly that the White House was in really, really bad shape. But that's the kind of story that you tell a child. My mother telling me the piano leg story, and I'm sure that what I really was thinking at the time was, why couldn't it be the leg of our piano? So I don't have to take the lesson every Saturday afternoon. So just to go back in history, and I'm going to keep going until...
You keep going.
And I was fascinated by this, the history of the White House. I put together a lecture on this that I gave earlier this year down in Florida, just because of the exhibit and because it's just a fun subject. But I wanted to do it as who ruined the White House for my grandfather. Which president screwed it up? Who drilled through the walls? Who put in heavy bathtubs? Who did all this stuff? So I went back and I started. George Washington picked the site, and I'm going to go through these kind of fast. George Washington picked the site for the new city of Washington. General Washington, President Washington, was a bit more grandiose than we think of him. He's the father of our country, the father of America, but he liked pomp and circumstance. He was very formal. He used to greet the men of the town in a study in New York with one hand on his sword and the other hand on a fake hat that he kept at his side so he wouldn't have to shake hands with anybody. And he just nodded and said a few words to everybody. So very formal stuff. But this is a little bit what Washington looked like in the early days. Very pastoral, very pretty. They envisioned using this site to build sweeping vistas. Versailles on the Paris on the Potomac. He chose Pierre Charles L'Enfant, who laid out Washington in this wonderful pattern, like fireworks, that you can see it. Much of it still looks like that today. Anybody here driven in Washington? Oh my God. I don't know how many times I've been lost in that town trying to figure out how to get around the traffic circles. But L'Enfant had this grand vision. Washington liked it. L'Enfant also designed the original White House to be about 3 times the size it is today. He designed a serious palace. Luckily for America, L'Enfant was replaced by James Hoban. L'Enfant managed to annoy pretty much everybody. He was very arrogant, very good, but very arrogant. He wouldn't share his designs with the commissioners who were chosen to oversee the building of Washington. And finally, one of the commissioners' house was right where L'Enfant wanted to build one of his grand avenues, so he had it knocked down. Yeah, that'll cost you your job. So Washington finally had to fire him. Hoban was sort of L'Enfant's opposite. He was an architect, but he was more of a builder. He was practical. He stayed on budget, all the stuff that the commissioners really appreciated, and that the new government appreciated. Thomas Jefferson appreciated it. And if you look, Hoban was from Ireland, and that's Leinster House, where he took some lessons. It's a ducal seat, and I've forgotten the name of the county now. You see, we should have written these things down. But you can see the resemblance between Leinster House, which is now the Irish Parliament, by the way, and you can see Hoban's drawings for the White House. So you know where he got his inspiration for the White House. The original White House was built, as you can see this was built all of brick on the inside, stone on the outside, thick 2 feet of brick, all the way throughout the inside of the home. So it was a sturdy house. Let me just, you don't suppose those sneaky British are the next? No, they're not good. And that's just a picture of the White House in 1836, 1837. And when the Adamses moved in, they were the first president and first lady to live there. The White House was unfinished, plaster still drying on the walls. They had the fires going in the fireplace, even in the summer, to dry the plaster. Nothing in the East Room. Mrs. Adams hung her laundry up to dry in the East Room. All right, now I got to go back. Okay. Ignore those guys for a second. So I went looking into this, looking at how can I pose this as who destroyed the White House for my grandfather. And I threw this out to the folks at the White House Historical Association. And by the way, if you're looking for White House history, their website is wonderful. They were a great help. And I spoke to a couple of the historians, and I said, I want to make this about who ruined the White House for my grandfather. And they laughed. And they said, yes, well, that's true. There was some air conditioning put in, and there's pipes, and that didn't help, and gas, and all of that. And they did some renovations, but that's not really. You can really only blame 2 presidents. You blame Theodore Roosevelt and Calvin Coolidge. But before you blame them, you have to blame the British. Thank you for laughing at that. You're the first audience that's done that. I kept thinking I needed to use the one from the Holy Grail to make it more apparent. I showed this in Florida, and people went, hey. I thought, I'm taking that one out, but Kurt wouldn't do it. So, the British, in 1814, the British burned the White House. Dolly Madison had laid out dinner for 40 people, formal dinner. The British came in, ate the dinner, apparently commented favorably on the Madeira, and then torched the place. And it burned hot. That's a great painting, Tom Freeman's painting. It burned very, very hot. They piled all the drapes, all the furniture, everything in the middle of the room, set it all ablaze. And it burned like an inferno like that, and then there was a storm coming, and it rained on it almost immediately after it really got going. And so it cooled very, very quickly, and everything cracked. The stone cracked, the brick crumbled. That's a picture, that's an engraving of the shell afterwards. Yeah. All they had was the walls. It was it. Everything else was turned to ash, and it was crumbling because of that. And this is a little out of sequence, but that's General Sir Bernard Montgomery after World War II, meeting Grandpa in front of the White House, and Grandpa had just finished telling Sir Bernard that the British burned the White House. To which General Montgomery replied, well, if they didn't pay you for it, you should go and burn Whitehall. That's why they're both laughing. So we get to Teddy Roosevelt, and what President Roosevelt did, he first of all he built the West Wing. That's how we got the West Wing. That's going over toward the State Department, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Toward the West Wing. So he built the West Wing because he had so many kids, and frankly, barn animals living in his house. He needed room for all of that, so he wanted the White House for the family. So he wanted business off-site. So he built the West Wing. He also, the main thing he did, and that is such a Roosevelt dining room. Look at the antlers, the stag at the end. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What he did between the family dining room downstairs and the state dining room, there used to be another staircase. There was another main staircase up to these. Has anybody seen the movie Lincoln? Daniel Day-Lewis? Okay, you know when the president goes down at the very end of the movie, when he's going to Ford's Theater, he walks down that stairway and then turns. That's what this stairway was like. It was a single riser from the second floor down to a landing, and then 2 stairs that came down onto the main cross hall. Roosevelt and his architect, Mr. McKim, knocked out that stairwell, and with it, the load-bearing wall between, yeah. So he could expand the state dining room. And McKim built this steel buttress from the roof. It was put in the roof to hold up the second floor like this, like a sling. It's not this, this. So they're holding up the second floor like that. Now this buttress is also embedded in walls that are not what they were when the White House was finished in 1800, but what they were when they refinished it again in 1817. It took them 10 years to build the White House originally, only 3 to build it back. And for very good reason. It's a symbol. And they were not going to let it sit there burnt out. They rebuilt it as quickly as they could. And Hoban, again, was the architect on that. And they didn't put all brick back in, they put wood for some of the interior walls. So it's weaker to begin with. Plus they were moving quick. They used inferior brick. So they had softer brick. The foundation was never very good. The ground was soft. And so now you have this buttress sitting on top of these crumbling walls, this wood, this inferior brick, and it's beginning to push things down. So TR did that. Calvin Coolidge came along and was told that the roof was in such bad shape he would have to fix it. And he hemmed and hawed. Mr. Coolidge didn't like to spend money. So he hemmed and hawed. It was $100,000 to replace the roof. And this was been in 1927, 26 or 27. He finally had to give in because it was in such bad shape. And he refinished what was then sort of attic space and turned it into a fully functioning 3rd floor using steel and concrete. So now you have this pancake, this hard crust on top of this crumbling. I always thought of it as an ice cream cake that's melting. It's just beginning to push down on this. That buttress isn't helping. The load-bearing wall is gone. And this is one thing that I put aside, and I put this aside for family stories because we have some family stories related to this. This is the sky parlor, the solarium on the roof that they put in when they redid the roof. And there's a nice family story about this concerning President Eisenhower's granddaughter, Mary Jean. And Mary Jean was 4 years old, and she was up there with a family retainer on Christmas, looking out the window. And she was being told, you keep looking out toward the Washington Monument, toward the ellipse, over the South Lawn. Your grandfather's going to light the national Christmas tree. And Mary Jean's 4, she's sitting there just looking out the window, waiting for this to happen. Nothing's happening, just wait. And finally, this tree explodes into brilliant light. And Mary Jean's like, whoa! And her comment to me was, he must be God. Who cares if he's president? And just to be a mean presidential grandson, I'm going to throw Mary Jean under the bus. She's here with us tonight, Mary Jean Eisenhower. We were talking today about the Eisenhower Library being in Abilene and some of the problems we share being removed from our, being sort of away from Kansas City for us and in Abilene for the Eisenhower Library. And I had to make the joke that, well, Mary Jean Eisenhower doesn't even live in Abilene. She lives in Independence. And she does, in one of my family's homes.
And Mary Jean, just to make it clear, we have a great respect for President Eisenhower. We just, despite the presidential progeny here. But I will say one thing on this, though. President Eisenhower recently in the C-SPAN ranking of presidents, usually Truman and Eisenhower, which is really quite remarkable for the Midwest if you think about it, for this region, they're usually number 5 and number 6. They kind of jockey back and forth. In the recent poll, Eisenhower has bumped Truman out of the 5th spot. They're behind Washington, Lincoln, and the 2 Roosevelts. But so apparently Truman is 6 and Eisenhower is now 5. But of course, around here we just call that fake news. I mean, we don't think that that's, but nevertheless. But it's good news for the region that both of them are very well respected by historians and by politicians alike.
and of course both of us, Mary Jean and I, both, the family jokes are that both of us hope that somebody finds some dirt on Washington or Lincoln so we can move both of them. No luck with that so far. Anyway, that's the sky powder. So you've got all that mess, and I'm going to take a little detour here. So the house is falling apart. I mean, seriously falling apart. And there's actually a good story about that. That early on they stabilized the second floor with these steel pipes and rods that they ran down from the roof through the floor, so my grandparents, wouldn't fall, through. And my mother and my grandparents lived like that for some time until they could get living arrangements settled and whatnot. And Grandpa was a very hands-on president with this. He took a great interest in the work. He talked to the builders. He talked to the architects, talked to the commissions. So he was very interested in all of this. And early on, he took a group of reporters and photographers on a tour of the second floor to show them how bad it was. You have to sell this. You're going to ask Congress for the $5 or $6 million that it takes for this project. You want the press on your side. And Grandpa was always interested in the information being out there. So he took this group of photographers and reporters upstairs, and George Thames, a New York Times photographer, told me this story. Grandpa stopped outside his bathroom on the second floor, and one of those pipes had been run down through the floor next to the toilet. And he said, this thing scares me. I'm going to be sitting in here some night and hit the plunger and wind up in the state dining room. And the Marine Band will play Hail to the Chief as I come through the ceiling. The only safe place in the White House on the second floor was the Truman balcony, which he had fought to get built. Congress wouldn't give him the money. Being a frugal man, he had saved enough money from his own household budget, so he paid for it himself. The balcony porches were important to my grandparents. You look at the Truman home, you've got that big porch on the front. Now this was their refuge. In and out of retirement, this was their refuge. You look at that's where they spent nice days. They were back there private. My grandmother let those bushes on the side grow up so people couldn't see from the street. So so an oasis was very important to my grandparents. So you had the Truman balcony, and you can tell who took this picture. It was my mother. She cut my grandmother in half. But she tried to rectify that, so I thought we'd also have the Mrs. Truman. I had to get both pictures in there. And of course, my grandmother, that's the way she always reacted to having her picture taken unbeknownst. Like, what are you doing? And it's been enjoyed by many presidential families, Kennedys, and the Carters, the Bushes. That's a nice picture. Now, and getting into some of the stuff, and the photographs downstairs are wonderful. Abbie Rowe took all of these photos. I think it's on the order of 200 of them in the collection. He documented the whole thing.
And a lot of the photos down in the exhibit right now too are based on this collection. So
right.
If you haven't seen them,
yeah,
they're
right. Some of the big photos they've got letters from my grandparents, letters from back and forth about the ghosts and the creaking and some great artifacts. Down there is an old original window counterweight that looks like it has a bullet hole in it, a nick from a mini ball, maybe even a British mini ball. When they burned the house, somebody fired off a gun. They were firing off guns, so that's perfectly possible. There's the West Sitting Hall with that huge crack, one huge crack there. And this is the Oval Study upstairs. Just to show you the brickwork and how thick it was, they gutted the White House entirely. They had to take it down to the outer walls.
Not to be confused with the Oval Office, the Oval Rooms in the White House itself.
And this was we think, the White House Historical Association and historian Bill Seals, who wrote a 2-volume set on White House history. Washington probably had quite a lot to do with that because he liked the Oval Room formality. When he was in New York as president, he liked having everybody line up. He would stand by the fireplace in an Oval Room so he had this kind of even access to everybody and could go around the room. So he probably insisted that Hoban put one of those in.
Not a lot of backslapping going on in that cabinet environment. It's very formal.
Can't imagine anybody backslapping George Washington. And they had to dig down to the foundation and that's Abbie Rowe right there with his camera. That's the photographer. And Mr. Rowe is posing there by the foundation. They dug down to shore up the foundation. They dug even further than that These are the new sub-basements they put in during that restoration. So the White House, what you see on the surface is nothing. It goes down a couple, 3 more levels and out from the house on all sides. I've never been allowed down there. Probably a good idea. And just to, and the caption of that, I don't know if you can all see it. Does this thing have a laser on it?
I don't. Does it?
No, it doesn't. Well, it does. Watch me point it right at my face and turn it on.
Yeah.
So if you look over, if you look back above the guy in the bulldozer's head, if you look above his head, you'll see a shadowy figure against the back wall. I've seen this photo posted online claiming flat out that that's President Lincoln. It's his ghost, and what they say the reason for that is because the Lincoln bedroom was somewhere above that, and he just fell down into the basement when they took out the floors. The bulldozer and the truck are interesting because, again, as I said, Grandpa took a great interest in this, and his interest was not only architectural, but also in preserving the symbol of this country, preserving the White House, the outer walls. When they got in there, they needed to get dirt out to dig those sub-basements. They wanted to knock out some of the original stone, the quarried stone on the outer walls, and Grandpa would not let them because that would be destroying the shell, the face of the White House. So what they had to do was take those machines apart and take them in piece by piece and rebuild them on the inside. They finally dug deep enough that they could widen out and get equipment, whole trucks in. But by this time they hadn't, so that was all carried in. But you can see the steel superstructure. These columns in the middle were what they were using to shore things up and throw. They had to get all of that stuff out of there, all of the wood and the plaster and all of that. So but this is the beginnings of that steel superstructure that was built to hold up the walls. Heating ducts got kind of big in the White House. So did the sewer pipes. The temptation to make a Washington sewer joke is almost impossible to resist.
This makes it easy to drain the swamp, right? And you've got the whole...
And what's actually sort of funny about that is that Washington, it was built on swampy land. And apparently Thomas Jefferson and presidents after him were afraid of the marsh behind the White House because of the vapors. God knows what he would think today. Now they thought they would not only do a service for the country, but also offset some of the cost of the restoration by giving away, selling pieces of the White House. So they collected usable wood like this. They even boxed up the bricks. This is a precursor to the pet rock. You can put bricks in boxes and sell them to people. You can they suggest you make gavels out of them, and there are some on display. Down in the exhibit, there are several gavels that were made from White House wood. So you could make these little knickknacks, and it didn't offset the cost of the restoration very much, if at all. But it was a nice thing to be able to give away these souvenirs. And pieces of the White House stonemasonry work went to each of the Grand Lodges, Masonic Grand Lodges, in every state, in every 50 state. Now, I have some of my Masonic brothers here in the audience. Don't ask them any questions about secrets afterwards. My grandfather once said, if the Masons have any secrets, I'll be damned if I know what they are. So they got stones. So the Grand Lodges of the United States each have a piece of the White House, which is important to my grandfather. He went looking for those. Never did find the cornerstone. He was looking for the cornerstone laid by George Washington, who was a Mason. This is the desk. This desk is now downstairs in that exhibit. You are looking at it here on the second floor of my grandparents' home, which is where it was originally. That is all made from White House wood, original White House wood. And it looked, that's actually neater than it looked when I was a kid. It was full of stuff. I mean, they piled it up on that desk. That cabinet, which is in the corner near the desk, is also made of White House wood. Did we ditch the photos of all the knickknacks and shortcuts that my grandparents took? I can't remember.
I think so.
Okay, well then I should
You
go
can
back.
talk about it, though.
Well, and my grandparents were very frugal people. And Carol Daig from the Truman home is here, too. I don't know where you're sitting, Carol. You're lucky. You escaped on this one, because I'm throwing everybody under the bus this evening. Do you see that cord that's behind the desk? You can see it hanging down there. There's a light above that desk on the ceiling, but there is no switch for it at the bottom of the stairs. So the electrician told my grandfather what it would cost, and he wanted the light to be able to turn on because he kept going up there in the dark and banging his shins on the desk and everything else. So the electrician said, well, you can put a switch in downstairs, and Grandpa said no, he didn't want to pay for that, so he just got a long piece of twine and tied it to the end of the cord. It hangs down right in the stairwell. You want to turn on the second floor light, you pull the cord and go up. So there's that, and another evidence of their frugality in the house. That wallpaper does not extend behind that cabinet. My grandmother said no one's going to see it anyway. So, and also when they went home from the White House, they used everything. Those shelves in the pantry, the storeroom above the kitchen at the back of the house, those are made from the packing crates they took their stuff home in from the White House. And you can see one of the packing crates beneath it. They used everything. They were very careful about all of that. This is just to show you some of the restoration. The blue room. I mean, look at the brick. Look at some of the thickness of that brick. How this house. They didn't use wood throughout, so there was still some of the original thick brickwork left. There's that buttress. Look at the size of that thing, hanging from above the second floor, above the third floor, and then ceiling. That's what held up the second floor of the White House for however many years before it finally just began to give way. That's the cracked beam above the family dining room that my mother's piano leg broke. And this is what the entrance hall. That's the grand staircase that comes down. You have right where that guy's standing. About to go up the stairs, that's where President and First Lady come down, formal dinners, events and whatnot. I was on that staircase the last year of President George Bush's administration in 2008 for the Christmas party. I was invited to light the menorah with a grandson of David Ben-Gurion, first president of Israel, Yariv ben Eliezer. And Yariv and I were given a little instruction beforehand by a rabbi. Mostly this is for the Goyim, right? Because I don't know how to light a menorah. Yariv knew what he was doing. But they gave us the instruction, and the rabbi at the end of it, because you light the candle with a candle that you hold, and Yariv and I were both going to hold the candle. And the rabbi, at the end of it, moistened his fingers and put out the candle. And Yariv said, why do you do it that way? And the rabbi said, I never blow out the flame of life with the breath of life. And Yariv said, apparently he hadn't heard this. And the rabbi said, but that's just me. You can do what you want. Blow it out. And Yariv said, yeah, okay. So we got the ceremony going. The president and the first lady are there, and Yariv and I light the menorah, and you could see his mind working. He knows the rabbi's out there, and he knows that everybody's watching him, and he wants to do the right thing, so he looks at the candle and reaches up and didn't moisten his fingers. And he just goes, and we went back to our seats. President, First Lady, Yariv, me. Yariv sits down. And Mrs. Bush, sweet lady, she's wonderful. She leans over and she says, are you okay? And he says, yeah. And the president leans around his wife and says, little souvenir of the White House there, Yariv. I almost barked out loud laughing. And the president, he was in a good mood. He was out. Yeah. And I always suspected that whatever we feel about various administrations, I always suspected that George Bush was a fun guy to be around, a really genuinely nice human being. And he had a good sense of humor that night. We all had our pictures taken with him and Mrs. Bush. They cycled us through the basement, stood us in front of a fireplace, took our pictures. And this was just after that Iraqi journalist had thrown a shoe at the president. And my wife had told me, under no conditions will you tell a shoe joke. That poor man's country is in turmoil. He has a right to throw a shoe. Don't you dare make fun of it. And I said, all right, all right, all right. So I got up to the President and First Lady, and they said, thank you again for coming. I said, thank you for having me. And I said, my wife told me I was not to make any shoe jokes. And the President smiled and said, oh, hell, go ahead. Everybody else is. So that's the main staircase they're rebuilding here. Building back the state dining room, absent the antlers at the end. Fixing up the West Sitting Hall. West Sitting Hall was where I wound up having breakfast with President and Mrs. Johnson when I was 7 years old, the morning after his inauguration. And this is the time when I realized what president meant. My parents didn't tell me that my grandfather had been president of the United States. I found out in school. Thank God it was first grade and not high school. I got to school that morning and my teacher said, wasn't your grandfather president? I said, I don't know. I went home to my mother that afternoon and I said, Mom, did you know? And she looked at me seriously and she said, yes. But just remember something. Any little boy's grandfather can be president. Don't let it go to your head. Well, it didn't. It went right over my head. I was 6. I had no idea what that meant. Well, sitting with the Johnsons that morning, after we were late leaving, we had breakfast and we were dragging it out. We were having a good time. We were going to miss our train. We were going back to New York. And so we go running out of the White House. And President Johnson had told us to relax several times. He said, just sit down, relax. The train will wait. And we're like, for you, yes. And finally, my father hustled us all out of there, and we were late. We got to Union Station by like 10:10. The driver didn't go in the front. He pulled around to the side and pulled up next to a train on the platform. And we started running for the train, and the conductor said, folks, just relax, relax, take your time. The White House called. That's when it hit me. I was 7. My father said, well, why the hell didn't he tell me he was going to do that? I wouldn't have run over here. Like, my reaction was, wow. Grandpa could stop trains. So that's where I learned this, was in the West Sitting Hall. There's that chandelier. They're rehanging that chandelier so it doesn't kill anybody ever again. This is their first day back. They had been out of the White House pretty much 3.5 years. This is March of 1952. He's got just, less than a year, about 10 months left of his presidency. At least he can move into this beautifully refinished and refurbished White House. And there it is, the East Room as it looked then. And I've been in a couple of ceremonies in the East Room, but the one that I liked the best was in 1960s. This was right before President Johnson left office. Lady Bird Johnson called my grandmother here in Independence and said, Mrs. Truman, we would like to rehang your official portrait in the White House, but we can't find it. And my grandmother said, that's because it's on my wall. And Mrs. Johnson said, what? You can't do that. That belongs to the American people. And she said, no, it doesn't. It's on my wall. It belongs to me. It's a picture of me. And she tried to argue a little more, and finally, Lady Bird Johnson knew when to give up. So they had 2 copies made. One is at the White House. The other is here, down the hall. The original is still on my grandmother's wall. So she held on to that painting. But we were there for the unveiling of the copy. There's that wonderful grand staircase. And I think one of the great stories about that is that the opening, they originally weren't going to have a railing there. But the Secret Service made them put it in because they could just imagine the president tripping and sailing right out through that opening into the cross hall. Not good. And that's the final slide. There he is. That is Abbie Rowe. He was originally a Park Service photographer, I believe, and he was working for the Park Service. He was outside doing Park Service labor, digging fences, all of that stuff. And Mrs. Rowe, he met Eleanor Roosevelt on one of her visits. And with her help, he got a job as a photographer. He's a good amateur photographer. He got a job as a Park Service photographer and eventually wound up White House photographer documenting all of this. Well-respected man. When he was near the end of his life and could not move about as easily, other photographers, the press photographers, always parted and made way for Abbie to get in there first. So quite a man, quite a photographic record. And that's the end of my slideshow.
That's the end of the show. That's all there is. There ain't no more. That's amazing. You know, it's a fascinating story, I think, not just of where the presidents have lived, but I think it points to a lot of how they lived. And one of the things that I thought was very fascinating was when you think about Abigail Adams hanging her wash in the East Room, you think about Mrs. Roosevelt apologizing for the condition of the White House because she hadn't maybe kept it up the way a good homemaker might. You know, it's hard for us to imagine today a First Lady being concerned about the laundry or about how, you know, whether they kept the house up properly or whatever, because we just assume those things are just done. There's a staff of people that just go about doing all of that. It's amazing to think. And I wonder when do you think that, or do you know, when did that change in the sense that they were just not able to think of it as a personal sort of a line item, that they had a certain amount of money they could spend and they could sort of clean the house and do what they wanted?
It seems to have been mostly with the modern presidency. When you get up, when we become much more industrialized and much more formal, Washington's much more crowded, much bigger, much more going on here. It got very formal, and it got, presidential staffs get bigger and bigger and bigger every time.
Right.
The grandpa used to have, he would sit down every morning in the Oval Office with just, half a dozen guys in front of him and go over the day's business and see what was what. Now it just takes an army. If you look at the, we've got stacks here at the Truman Library with all of Grandpa's personal papers, items, speeches, all of it, correspondence. The Clinton Library has this 2-story vault with these shelves that move on motors to go back and forth. And they have so much that those kind of shelves where you have to move one to get to the other. You can't go between two at the same time. You have to move them almost like dominoes that won't fall over. You just squeeze them together. But that's not only written, I think, paper, but emails. They've got electronically as well. So just the amount, as it's gotten more and more complicated, as government gets complicated, so does the White House. Thomas Jefferson's study was what's now the state dining room. Was the smaller state dining room in his day, but that's where he greeted people. And I forget, I think it was Andy Jackson was in there, one of Grandpa's favorite presidents. Somebody gave President Jackson a big wheel of cheese. A big wheel of cheese. And he invited the public in to eat it. And they ate quite a lot of it. They didn't eat all of it, though, so he had to throw a lot of it out. But Grandpa complained in some of his writings that people ground that cheese into the carpets. They walked all over it. So the White House was a much different place, much more formal as I think as it's been built along, as the presidency's gotten more complicated.
I just think as it's appropriate that Truman is credited for had the opportunity to renovate the White House because he renovated the whole executive branch in terms of how it operates. And you think about, it's hard to picture Jackie Kennedy doing the laundry. I think that, from the time that I've been holding that one they're just waiting for that moment when he would take a drink. But, and I don't know if we know anything about Mamie Eisenhower, but it just seems to me that from the time of the Truman renovation, that really in some ways marks the birth of the modern presidency in terms of the way the first family lives.
Well, it's certainly a good...
we good for questions?
What, are you looking for the high sign?
No, I'm looking for Mary out there to see if she's got a question. Okay.
Okay.
She didn't touch the laundry or cook. She didn't burn water.
Okay.
Now, you're talking about Jackie or Mamie?
Both.
Probably both.
Question? Go ahead, Mary. Let's take a question.
How long did the renovation last? How much money did it cost, do you know? And did he have to get an act of Congress to do it?
The Congress had to approve the funds. I think it was about $5.5 million, somewhere in there, and it took about 3.5 years. So he had to move out almost the minute he got back from winning the election in 1948. They moved out in late 48 is when they left the house.
And I know that Clifton said earlier that they were sort of forced. The house was falling down. There were problems with it, so somebody had to do that. But I think it's telling and quite a remarkable thing that the Trumans basically sacrificed their second term to be able to create the White House that we have today. Any family only gets to live there for a very short amount of time, either 4 or 8 years. and they gave up half their time to create, the kind of residence that we enjoy today. Now, somebody would have had to have done it eventually, obviously, but I think it's kind of telling that they chose to do that.
Well, they enjoyed Blair House, which is very nice. David McCullough had a good story about that. My grandparents were often separated during his presidency because my grandmother came back here to Independence to help take care of her mother. And she was always seen, she was her mother's closest friend and confidant. She kind of ran the household after my great-grandfather, David Wallace, committed suicide. So she's the oldest child. So she was often pulled away from Washington. And she came back, and she'd been gone for a couple of months. And folks in the staff reported that it was wonderful to have her back because my grandfather lit up, she lit up, everybody, they were so happy to be around each other. The mood just elevated in Blair House. My grandmother came downstairs the next morning, and she took the head usher aside, and she said, "We have a little problem on the second floor. There's oh hell, one of the slats on the bed is broken." This is, of course, more than any grandchild wants to know. My own son is like this. Wesley has, you want Wesley to leave the room, just start talking like that. And I told Kurt earlier, Wesley's decided that he said, "I know you and Mom have done it 4 times. Once for practice and once for each of us. That's it." So children do not want to hear this.
You have another question? Please, another question.
Please.
Somebody.
I've just dived into my grandparents' sex life. And my own. It's Washington.
Yeah.
No.
That's a great segue for my question.
Uh-oh.
You had mentioned that legacy is what your job is really about. And I feel so fortunate to live in Independence and have Truman Library. I feel so fortunate to have Truman's grandson alive and promoting the history of Harry Truman. You mentioned your sons or your kids. What is next in the legacy of Truman's descendants?
Well, I actually may have shot myself in the foot on that because I couldn't make it to the recent fundraiser, the Wild About Harry fundraiser, because I had a conflict. So I sent my middle child, my son Wesley Truman Daniel. And apparently he did a really good job. And so that's what I've been hearing. And it's not just, he did a really good job. It's also, it's been nice seeing you, Clifton. It's been nice having you around. But, he's 6'1", he's younger. His bigger shoulders. Goodbye. So Wesley is, when talking about legacy, the other half of the legacy, and I think other presidential children and grandchildren will tell you this, it's not only preserving your ancestors' legacy, but seeing what you can do with it on your own. It's a selfish thing. It's just trying to find a positive way in which to use it. Mary Jean is the head of People to People International. So she's continuing her grandfather's work, continuing work with reconciliation with I have taken it. I went in 2012 with Wesley and his brother Gates and my wife Polly to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to talk about reconciliation there. Wesley and I went back in 2013 and recorded more than a dozen survivor stories, which are here at the Truman Library, and we're hoping to make available for use by anybody, so that the survivors came to me no anger at all, no asking for an apology. They just want us to understand what it was like to live through that, so that we don't do it again. That's their greatest fear. So I've been able to, you take it and do with it as you will. And I've also, we also have stories from American servicemen who they and their descendants would not be alive today had he not made that decision. But you have to have both stories. As I told Wesley when he was very young, you need to understand your grandfather's and your country's decision, but you also need to know what that cost the citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's the legacy you try and we try and keep it going. Wesley's interested. He's I didn't have to twist his arm to make him come here, and I'm sure he'll do something in the future. I don't know about his brother and sister. Actually, his younger brother is writing a book for Truman State University Press on his great-grandparents. So, at least I hope he is. He promised to. He's got the.
There's an interesting point here, though, that I'll say that you wouldn't, and that is that I think the presidential children and grandchildren who are really successful in promoting the legacy in the way that I think is resonating with you is that it's not about politics. It's not political. I mean, there's something larger, there's something bigger, there's something more important. And certainly Harry Truman represents that. I mean, we get, the people who admire Harry Truman are not just from one party. I mean, we get a lot of people on both sides of the aisle. And I think that what Clifton has done so well is just sort of stay above the fray. It'd be very easy for him to make political statements, especially to the Japanese press and others that try to pressure him into doing that. But I think to his credit and to the credit of the legacy, he stays above that fray. And that's part of the success. That's part of what gives that legitimacy, I think, to the spokesman role. So.
Again, talking about the legacy, all the presidents from Eisenhower through to Clinton have an airport named after them. President Truman does it. Would the family be in favor of renaming the Kansas City airport after President Truman?
Oh my God. I don't know. It'd be weird for me to fly into Truman Airport. It's weird enough when I go to Key West and drive down Truman Avenue. And what's even weirder is the Truman XXX Adult Bookstore. I can't tell you how many of my friends have sent me pictures of that. It's a block away from the Margaret Truman Laundrette. Grandpa himself, he has said time and time again when people have asked, Grandpa has said that he really didn't want monuments to himself. He wanted this building to be a teaching institution not about him, but about his presidency, about the history surrounding his presidency. He wanted people to learn from this. So he wasn't big on statues or airports being named after him. He often said that, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier, the complete lack of ego. What was it he had? We were talking about this in your office. He had someone had asked him if he wanted a monument, and he had said no because I didn't. Was it South Korea? Somebody. Sorry, I'm mixing things up here. But they wanted a monument to him, and he said, no, I'd rather you didn't do that because I didn't do that. This country did that for you. America did that. He looked at what he did as all of us doing it because, as he said on film today I was watching, if the president doesn't have the backing of the American people, he doesn't get a lot done. He's their representative. So, yeah, that was not intended as a joke. But so he really, and of course when it comes to flying, I don't think my grandmother would approve to the airport because she was terrified of airplanes. Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Clifton.
Oh, go ahead.
Oops, sorry.
Well, you probably are familiar with this story, but I happened to be in the mayor's office when your grandmother passed away. And she had left the Truman home to the people of the United States. Well, the National Park Service said, no, thank you. We'd have enough property to take care of, and we can't afford it. And so we had to use the power of the mayor's office to lobby our Congress representatives to accept the Truman home and preserve it for the people. And I just want to thank them and your family for leaving this legacy to the people of the United States. If your grandmother hadn't thought of that, it wouldn't have happened, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Sure. There's only one part of the house that she didn't leave to the American people originally, and that was 2 weeks out of the year. She left it in her will that my mother could stay in her old room 2 weeks out of the year. And I asked my mother, I said, that's really nice. Why did she do that? And Mom said, I don't know. I don't want to stay in the house 2 weeks out of the year. And she also locked the attic and hid the key because my brother Will and I got on the roof through it one year and scared the hell out of my grandmother. And the Park Service actually called my mother and said, and my mother went up on the roof with us, by the way. I was 12, so that would have made her somewhere in her 40s. She went up on the roof with us. And the Park Service called my mother and said, you know, do you know where the key to the attic is? And my mother said, hell no, she hid it from me too.
All right, we have one question that's come through from Facebook. So this is from James Marples, who's watching online. What was the most troublesome aspect of the restoration of the White House, in Harry's opinion?
Whoa. I don't know. I'm sure that Grandpa would say that the most troublesome aspect about anything you do in Washington is dealing with the people in Washington. Trying to get the money, trying to get it through, trying to get it all done was probably, it's the building, the rebuilding itself and the restoration was work, and work well done. But I'm sure trying to get the funding secured and getting committee members to agree on everything and getting Congress, it probably wasn't even that bad because there was no way that they could not do it. I mean, it was falling apart. If they'd stayed any longer, they would have all been on the first floor. It was a mess. But that's probably what he would have said was dealing with fellow Washingtonians. I was wondering where that was going to stop. It just kept.
It sounds like you get to the White House quite often. Is that a usual thing for children, for family of ex-presidents to be invited back?
Depending on who you're related to and who's in office. I went to the Johnson White House twice for the inauguration for the portrait, but I was there during President Ford's administration, and I was in my freshman year of college. I took a girlfriend my parents were living in Washington, and I had a girlfriend visiting for the Thanksgiving holiday. And she and I went out in Georgetown the night before. I had a real good time. And my father arranged for us to tour the White House in the morning, so we really didn't want to go. Can we just sleep in? No, we made arrangements. So, I mean, I pulled on a sweater over an unclean shirt and a kind of wrinkly jacket, and I had my jeans on. I ran my fingers through my hair. I don't think I shaved. And we went over and got in line and went through the main gate for the main tour and no barriers, no nothing. This is 1975. Thanksgiving 1975. And we went in through the gate, and I'd gotten 10 feet past us, and the guard at the gate said, "Mr. Daniel?" I said, "Yes." So the Sergeant-at-Arms would like to see you. Okay. And my girlfriend immediately goes, "Why? What did you do?" And of course, being teenagers in the 70s, we're patting our pockets going, are we carrying anything that we shouldn't? So I went over, very nervous, went to the Sergeant-at-Arms. I said, "Hi, I'm Clifton Truman Daniel." And he said, "Oh, yeah, we've been looking for you. Mr. Farrell would like to see you inside." And Mr. Farrell was the White Hat protocol, the tours, all of that, all the public office. So I walked in and I said hi to Mr. Farrell, and I said, what's going on? What's wrong? And he said, "Oh, nothing. Your mother called." He said, "Do you know the number?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, have a seat." He sat me down at the White House switchboard to call my mother. And I called her and I said, What are you doing calling me at the White House?" And she said, "Hey, I used to live there. I can call if I want." And I said, "Okay, what do you want?" And she said, "I just wanted to tell you where to meet us for lunch." So my mother's calling the White House to give me lunch instructions. Well, now, having found out I was there, Mr. Farrell put us on a nice small personal tour, and we were sort of circling the Chinese women's national basketball team. There are, in fact, 6'5" Chinese women in the world, and this was their basketball team, and they had an interpreter, and they were looking at things, and we kept crossing paths with them. And finally, we're enjoying this. My girlfriend's enjoying this, despite the dirty shirts and the no makeup and the hair through the, And Mr. Farrell took us out into the Rose Garden, and he said, "The president is going to greet the Chinese women's basketball team. There's going to be a ceremony. Would you like to watch?" Yes, we would. This is great. We're standing back with the press. While the ceremony is getting ready to begin, he comes over again and says, I just spoke to the Oval Office. When the president comes out to greet the team, we're going to scoot back around to the door of the Oval Office and you can say hi to President Ford. That's when my girlfriend lost her mind. Oh my God, I can't meet the President of the United States. And she's almost doing this. and I'm thinking the same thing. I'm going, oh God. Well, then I couldn't. She was so nervous, and I was a bad boyfriend, bad husband. When she started worrying about this, I said, President Ford and I are fraternity brothers. I should slip him the secret handshake. I wonder. And I started tickling my palms like this, and she said, don't you dare tickle the president's palm. We'll be arrested. And the whole way over to the Oval Office, I'm doing this. And she's hitting me and freaking out. And there's a picture taken by David Hume Kennerly of me shaking hands with President Ford and my girlfriend standing between us like this. Just waiting for me to do something stupid, which, I often didn't disappoint.
They wait long?
Yeah, I didn't disappoint her. But that was the most unusual visit I've ever had to the White House.
Once again, thank you very much for being here, sir. And I'd like to share my favorite truism, which is if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But if you might, and this is just a subject that could go on for hours, so I know it will be a very short answer, but being a brother Mason myself and looking at your grandfather truly as a role model for Freemasonry and what it represents, could you speak a little bit to how that informed his life and the way he conducted himself in the office of president?
It did, we have a few Masons here, and I'm just shocked that you admitted it. You outed all of us. But again, Masonry, for those of you who are not Masons, there's been a lot of misconceptions over the years. Thank you, Dan Brown. I'm sorry I left my black cloak at home. But what Freemasonry is at its core about being a better human being. You're asked to join you can ask to join, but you are recommended, you are brought in by people already Masons. And you spend your life in Freemasonry on self-improvement. And there's also charity, they're like a lot of fraternal organizations, but at the core of it is making yourself a better human being. And my grandfather believed very strongly in that. He took that from Masonry, and he also gave that back as much as he could. And of course, just to one of my, and I have to explain this to the non-Masons, which is like all of you. One of my favorite stories, on the campaign trail in 1948, he found that a young man was about to be raised as a Mason, about to be made a Mason, 3rd degree. And this young man had been a corpsman on the presidential yacht, the Williamsburg. And Grandpa said, I'm going to take some time out this evening and go to this young man's ceremony. And he did. He went to this young man's ceremony, went to his lodge and went to the ceremony. And he's getting ready to go in, and the Secret Service starts to follow him. Well, if you're not a Mason, you're not allowed in the lodge. So Grandpa said, you can't come in here. And the Secret Service said, but we're the Secret Service. And he said, I don't care. You're not Masons. You can't come into the lodge with me. And they complained back and forth. And finally, he said, look, I'm as safe in there with those guys as I'd be anywhere else on this planet. Don't worry about it. Again, at the core of Masonry, you're safe with your brothers. We're there to support each other. But the image I have for those non-Masons, ceremonially, there is a man called a Tyler at the door who guards the door to the lodge with a sword. And I just pictured the Secret Service armed to the teeth with guns, and this guy was, watch it, I've had a drink, So, but again, the core of, it's about self-improvement, it's about brotherhood, it's about doing right. Grandpa went to Washington, his mother quoted Mark Twain to him, he kept the sign on his desk, always do right. You will gratify a few people and astound everybody else. So.
All right, I think we have time for one more. So.
Thank you so much for coming. You're very entertaining.
Tell my wife.
Yeah. back to the subject of what Harry Truman's biggest problem was with renovation. My reading was that he had difficulty with the timeline, getting it done, getting it finished.
Yeah, well, they had, you wanted to get done quickly. You had to get it done right. And of course, they went over time and on all that, it's, as with any construction project. But yeah, he did want to get it done so he could live in it for at least a little bit. And and he said in his, I've just been looking at a lot of videos of my grandfather this afternoon, and the reason for that is, I'll just throw this out here, this fall in Wilmington, North Carolina, I'm going to play my own grandfather in the one-man show, Give 'Em Hell Harry. Might be the stupidest thing I've ever agreed to, but we'll see how that goes. But so I've been, but in his farewell address, he talks about that he has rebuilt the White House, rebuilt it for President Eisenhower. He wanted it to go on. He was being, the orderly transfer of power, so he wanted it for that reason as well. So yeah, he wanted the timeline. I don't know all the nuts and bolts of how much trouble they ran into, but any construction project, I assume. Or do you know something I don't? No, good. Dodge that one.
Clifton, one of our youngest audience members would like to ask a question. Would you take one more?
Sure. Thank you, Bill.
How many years did your grandfather live in the White House?
He lived in the White House, let's see, he would live in the White House out of 7.5 years as president. He lived in there about 4 years. So 3.5 years during the restoration, he could not live in the house.
About half and half.
Yeah, half and half.
Very good.
Okay.
Well, thank you all very much for being here tonight. We've enjoyed having you. Please come again. Thank you, Clifton. Well done.
All right.
Thank you.
Do we walk off?
Yes.